And live stream is loading.
Great, and thank you, Will, for loading up the deck here. Jen, if you're listening, this is the PowerPoint version, so your triangle will be animated.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Live stream is loading.
Oh. And I'm just going to test the live stream to make sure it looks okay, at least on my
And
end.
confirming that live stream is up right now.
Fantastic. There it goes. Live. This is like my chance to pretend I'm a news anchor. And I'm just going to very nice. Well, Annie, usually folks come in just at the hour. There aren't too many early birds in this group. And I think Meredith, any last minute notifications that people can't be here, you can just notify us in the chat. But otherwise, we're expecting a nice group today. So we'll get started. For those of you watching on the live stream, we'll get started in just about 5 minutes. All right, welcome, welcome. If you're watching on the live stream, we're going to get started in about 3 minutes, so just hang tight. Welcome to anyone who's watching on the live stream. We're going to get started in just about a minute as RPAG members trickle in. Welcome, everyone. It's just about 2 o'clock, so RPAG members should be joining us, including Summer. Hi there, Summer. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. How is your fall treating you?
Busy. It's busy.
Busy. Okay.
Sure, everyone's is, but yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Hopefully you have a break coming up here in late winter that you can look forward to.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. And hi there, Eliza and Joel. Good to see you. Hi.
Hello.
How are you doing this fall, Eliza?
Pretty well. It's just gone so quickly. Or
Yeah.
just, I mean, or the year. I would say summer went so quickly. So we're still early fall, but I feel like it's just gonna disappear.
Yep. Yep. I know the feeling well. And hi there, Joel. What about you? How's the season treating you?
So far so good. Yeah, feeling the fall in the air.
Good. And Ezra, I've heard the Northeast has had a beautiful fall. Are the rumors
Well,
true?
we had a beautiful fall.
Yeah.
Today was in the 30s and 40s, which is just really quite lovely.
Oh, wow. Okay.
By Thursday, it's going to get up to 78.
Yeah. My family on the East Coast keeps sending me photos and they're like in short sleeves and I don't know.
I mean, we still have flowers blooming in the yard. So we like to say this Chinese hoax has gone a little too far.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah. Well, enjoy it while it lasts. I know there'll
yeah,
be one day when you'll be
no,
shoveling and,
it's
waiting for
been
that.
it's been quite lovely. And when we do have like a Halloween night that's warm and it's just like that's really precious. So
It is for sure, especially to have a grandbaby who can get dressed up for the first time. It's very fun.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're not consulting me on what to dress her in, but I'm sure it'll be cute.
Very rude. And hi there, Kate. Welcome. Good to see you. So we have,
Hello.
hi. So let's see. We have Summer, Eliza, Ezra, Joel, Kate, Katie. That's 6. Let's give everyone another minute, knowing that this time of year, people often are in back-to-back meetings. Any follow-up dates from you, Kate?
No, not on my end.
Okay. Please. Okay, well, I've rearranged you on my screen like I like to, so all the members are on top. Let me do one more. I'm going to go into more detail about why my wonderful colleague Annie is here, but just as a way for her to get to know you all, if you wouldn't mind keeping your cameras on to the extent that you're comfortable with this meeting, I think that'll help her put a face to a name. So I think knowing we have a number of items on our plate today, I think we can get going. So Will, can you go to the next slide? Great. So I think you all should be comfortable with the tech here, but as an RPAG member, kind of mimicking a meeting environment, you all can use the chat. We can go back and forth with PSE staff. Raising hand is really a great option for RPAG members as a conversation is unfolding. We're going to have a few designated places to take breaks and to have a conversation. But for members of the public and observers, this feature will be turned on. Oh, forgive me, it's not turned on until the very end, when members of the public will have a chance to raise their hand for the public comment period. We don't use a Q&A feature, and if captioning helps you track a conversation, that's live and going. So you can go to the next slide, please. So my request, as always, is just to be constructive and courteous. I'm guiding the group process. Some topics are going to generate a lot of good discussion. I'm going to allow those to go on to the extent possible, knowing that there is a number of things on the agenda today. This is live stream. This is open to the public, so watch your acronyms. And then we have the feedback form and email. And if Emily can drop that in the chat, thank you. If you have thoughts after this meeting, it's great to put those in writing. We're going to focus on the topics today. And then again, for members of the public who are observing, thank you for being here. And we'll hear from you at the end of the meeting. Next slide. As usual, we're opening these meetings with a safety moment. This one is Halloween themed. Not surprisingly, it's 2 days away. So if you are driving, use caution and drive extra slow. If you are walking, make sure you cross the street at sidewalks. Stay on those sidewalks and stick to well-lit areas. Add a reflective or light up element to costumes for visibility. Sometimes I feel like LED lights were invented solely for the purpose of costumes, so take advantage. And then this I did not know, but keep candy like chocolate or sugar-free treats with xylitol stored out of reach of pets. So let's keep it a safe holiday for everyone. You can go to the next slide, please. So our speakers today, there's myself, and I'll focus on PSE for a moment. So Philip Popoff, who you know is the Director of Resource Planning, Kara Durbin, the Director of Clean Energy Strategy, Colin Crowley, some of you haven't met yet, but he's involved with Energy Resource Development as a director, and Jennifer, you all know, as a manager in operations and gas. But importantly, I want to introduce Annie Kilberg-Smith. PSE sent out a notice that I will be stepping back from my time at Triangle after 10 really good years, looking to take a break from consulting and shift careers paths just a little bit here. But I've been working really closely with Annie for about 6 years at Triangle. She's a director out of the Oregon office and has come on board over this last month and is just bringing a tremendous skill set to the Triangle team. So I'm going to let Annie introduce herself a little bit, but I just couldn't be more excited for you to get to know Annie. So Annie, you want to share a few words?
Yes, hey, thank you, Sophie. Annie Kilberg-Smith here. And as Sophie said, I'm based out of the Oregon office. It's great to finally see some of your faces after being onboarded and hearing about your name so much. I'll share a little bit about myself. I've been working in the environmental public policy facilitation sector for over a decade. Really excited to be taking on this facilitation role with PSE and the RPAG and build on the amazing foundation that I know Sophie has established with this group. This project fits really well with my strengths and interests, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know all of you and hearing about your goals and your interests in this process. Just to give you a little bit of background about the types of groups I've helped with in the past, I like to do a lot of facilitation of technical work groups, so including big collaborative projects like the Columbia River System Operations Environmental Impact Statement process is one of the ones that I'd like to highlight. Just we worked on that project for a couple years, including working with many technical groups over 4 different states and with a big team here at Triangle was something we were really proud of. And I think that work really translates well to you in working with your group as well. And beyond working in this process of the ISP, I'm really hoping to just build a path to help promote sustainability and community trust. I know how critical this project is to the future of the region, and I'll be here to help support you along that way. And after today, just so you know, I'll be reaching out to do some one-on-one conversations with each of you. Hopefully we can get to know each other a little bit better before we continue this process together. And so you can look forward to hearing from me, and hopefully we'll get to be able to find time together so I can hear about your interests as well. With that, I'll hand it back over to Sophie.
Yeah, thanks so much, Annie. I'm excited to hear about the great work you're going to do with all these really talented RPAG members. So that's who's at the table. Annie and I are going to be co-facilitating today, so you'll see both of us throughout this meeting. And then at the end, I can give you my personal email so you can stay in touch. But you can go to the next slide, please, Will. So our agenda for the next 2 hours, we're doing this intro and agenda review now. We're going to shift into kind of an RPAG membership discussion, thinking about how the group will evolve with kind of shifting to this ISP. Then we're going to hear from Kara with Colin supporting about the CETA interim targets update. Kara sent you an email about this, so just kind of going to some more detail there. We'll switch up and then have Jen talk about scenario framing and discussion and do an interactive mural activity. So we expect you to participate in that. And then we'll end, as we always do, with public comment. Emily in the chat is just posting the agenda and the slides in case you want to follow along at home. So you can go to the next slide, please. So with that, Kara's going to open, and then we're going to, Annie and I are going to tag team some more conversation about you all as RPAG members and the people around the table. So go ahead, Kara. You can go to the next slide, Will. Oh, you're muted, Kara.
Double muted. Now can you hear me? Gosh, I haven't made that mistake in a while. Okay, thank you. So we wanted to talk a little bit with you all some more about RPAG membership and what we're thinking about going forward. As you know, Jim Dennison of the Sierra Club informed us recently that he is no longer able to participate in the RPAG. And we also had a vacancy arise earlier this year when Alondra Regalado, on behalf of the Western Energy Storage Task Force, or WEST, left our group. So that's 2 vacancies now, since we sort of seeded the RPAG as part of the 2025 IRP process. And so now, now sitting where we're at, and given the broader scope of this new integrated system plan, we're planning to reopen the RPAG application process sometime later this year. And before Sophie and Andy kind of walk through what we think that looks like, I just want to revisit a key theme that we heard from you previously when we were thinking about RPAG membership, and that was really that equity perspective. And today, so we'll talk about what we heard from you all there and what we're thinking, and also would really also like to invite a conversation from all of you in identifying any areas or gaps in expertise you think that we may have, knowing that we now have the couple of vacancies that we do, but also just stepping back and thinking more broadly about the scope of this ISP, which we're still all figuring out, but we have a better sense now, I think, than we did a few months ago, and what that work brings that may be a little bit different than a traditional IRP. So one major theme that we really heard from many of you regarding membership was a strong interest in making sure that equity interests are represented on the RPAG, and that at the same time we also avoid having that equity perspective be siloed within our planning work. And so you may recall back when we were working on the 25 IRP and building this RPAG, we did a lot of outreach that both on PSE side and our consultants in the recruitment cycle, looking for potential members that could really bring that unique equity perspective. While we weren't successful then in finding someone, we're still very open to and continue to seek one or maybe more than one individual that might be a good fit for that kind of perspective. So if you have ideas or individuals in mind as we potentially reopen this process, let us know. We also believe that there's not a single solution that really will work here. And so just know that we're going to continue to prioritize considering equity and thinking about it in all areas of our resource planning effort as we kind of learn how to think about this together. So from our standpoint, we still are open to and looking for that perspective if we're able to find one. And at the same time, I would say we feel that our company-wide focus on equity, our partnership, and our ongoing dialogue with our equity advisor group, who really we work with regularly around clean energy planning and equity issues, and then also the expertise and voice that all of you RPAG members bring to this equity conversation. We think all of those things still set us up well to meaningfully address equity in this ISP. So just wanted to kind of address that at the outset. And then I think, Sophie, Annie, I think we're going to kind of transition and talking more like what that recruitment process might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kara. And go to the next slide, Will. So I'm going to recap what happened last year in 2023 that got all of you to the table. And then Annie will talk about the thinking moving forward. So last time when you all applied, you had to really emphasize 3 different areas in your application. One was your experience and your organizational affiliation. So what organizations or entities have you worked for? Kind of you're expressing your interest in joining, so making the case why I think you would be a good member of this body here. And then there was an emphasis on diversity of voices, which was kind of broadly defined of, do you bring a unique perspective either through lived experience or technical experience or anything like that. And then once we got all the applications in, we did a blind evaluation. So there was kind of a core group of PSE staff, as well as another neutral third party that we brought on for this, who evaluated all the applicants. And at the end of the day, we looked at the top applicants, and you all around the table are the folks who were ultimately selected. So a process is going to move forward that Annie's going to talk about, but because you all were the ones who experienced it firsthand, I invite you to provide us suggestions of, how it could be improved. And Annie, do you want to talk about what you all have in mind for this coming couple of months?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sophie. So now that we've talked about the past, we can go to the next slide and talk about the RPAG recruitment application process that is up amongst us now, and hopefully inspire a little bit of interest in the group as well. So as you can see on your screens, we've put together an overview of the RPAG recruitment and application process, and that there are a few steps that are going to occur over the next few months. First, recruiting of 2 new members. We'll have them go through the application selection process, as we mentioned, inform candidates of their selection, and orient them with the group's norms, as well as including reviewing the charter And hopefully that will all be happening by the end of February and trying to wrap it up by then. Next slide. So as you know, we are aiming to bring in 2 new members who can add some fresh perspectives and energy to the group. And the hope is that this expansion could really strengthen and diversify the group. So looking at this slide, you see a list that reflects the 2023 interests, such as energy policy organizations, the commission, and equity or social justice organizations. But looking forward to what you want this group to look like in 2025 and beyond, we want to ask this group a few questions, and we would like to kindly request that you respond to those questions by filling out an online survey that we're going to pop into the chat to provide, and the survey results are going to provide PSE with some suggestions on potential members. So Emily is going to pop that in the chat. So if you can click on that link and open it in your browser and take the next few minutes while I'm talking to hopefully fill that out. You will see that the first question is just your name, and then there's 4 questions after that. Is everyone able to open that? If you have any troubles, please go ahead and raise your hand and we can help you with it.
Oh, Emily, not the doodle poll, the survey, please.
The survey for the RPAG, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so while she's getting that link for you, it's basically a list of a couple questions. One will be just entering your name, and then it will take you to the second page. What we're going to ask you is what, if any, interest or expertise is currently missing from the RPAG. We'd like to hear from you about that, as well as do you have any recommendations for who could represent that missing interest? If you are willing to provide their contact information of somebody that's specific or an organization, we would love to receive that, their phone number, their emails, etc., so we can do some direct outreach and marketing of the potential recruitment process to them. And then if you're willing to potentially introduce PSE to that individual or organization, we'd love to know that as well, so that we can just link up with you directly and make that introduction as direct as possible. Also note, we have the same survey for the public. So if you are a member of the public listening in today and would like to suggest a member organization, please go ahead and click on the link Emily's providing to you all as well. So Emily, if you can pop that in the chat for the public. And I'll give you a few more moments to finish that up. In addition, I did want to mention this, in addition to the survey, PSE is going to would like to follow up with RPAG members to potentially partner on reaching out to folks very directly. And one of the questions PSE brought up today is they're wondering if members would be willing to potentially post on social media or send an email to get the word out about recruitment within your network. So if you are willing to do that, PSA is happy to provide a mini toolkit with a draft email and a social media post for you. If that sounds doable and easy enough, they will make it as easy on you as possible. Please go ahead and just give us a thumbs up or another positive emoji reaction. If that doesn't work for you, please let us know by typing in the chat. And if you have another possible suggestion, we'd love to hear that as well. Was everyone able to get on that link and submit their suggestions? If you weren't, go ahead and just raise your hand and we can assist you. Okay. All right, well, thanks everyone for your feedback. Oh, Kate, yes?
I was just going to ask if there would be any way to label which of the links are which in the chat. I feel like I have like 15 tabs open, so I'm just trying to figure it out. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Emily, do you mind just putting in the survey link for the RPAG members and putting RPAG member survey right in front of it with a colon? Thank you. And thanks, Kate, for that suggestion. Okay, so hopefully everyone can get that open. It should just take you a few moments, we're hoping, and hopefully you can do it during this meeting so it's not an additional time after this meeting. PSE is going to take that information into account as they start the search for new members. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Sophie to introduce the next agenda topic.
Mm-hmm. And I think since we've gotten going, we've now really had a critical mass. I just want to say hi to Megan and Dan and Fred and Froy. Good to see you all. If you missed it in the beginning, Annie will be taking over as the facilitator as this group because I will be transitioning out of Triangle. So it's going to be fun to co-facilitate with her today. And as well, now that we do have a critical mass here, Kate, I'll probably drive you crazy and asked officially for Emily to post the doodle poll, just the doodle poll in the chat to these panelists here. Meredith of the PSE is working hard to try to schedule your December meeting. So another thing you can just fill out on the fly if possible, to fill out that doodle poll. All right. Well, now that we've inundated you with surveys and doodles and all sorts of things, I'll just say thank you in advance for spreading the word in whatever way you can. I think this is a really technical group and really relies on people that have kind of a depth and breadth of knowledge, often people that are in your network. So we encourage you to recruit people that you'd like to sit on this table with. I guess sit around the table rather than on the table. So you can go to the next slide, please, Will. Okay, so we're going to begin a discussion in a moment about the CETA interim targets. There's a lot of great information here that Kara has provided, as well as Colin. And so just to allow her to kind of get through the flow, we're going to allow Kara to speak kind of up until slide 17, and then we're going to take a pause for questions there. So if you can just hold tight on those questions, I'd so appreciate that. So Kara, without further ado, do you want to share a little bit more about these interim targets updates?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Thanks for the intro. And I'm pleased to have Colin Crowley here with me. For those of you that don't know Colin, he's the Director of Energy Resource Development at PSE. And he will be speaking a little bit later on about our current RFP process, and take any questions you may have about our last one and just some of the potential we see through that process. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the petition that we recently filed with the Commission related to our Clean Energy Implementation Plan interim targets. And we do anticipate the Commission will take that up for consideration at their open meeting next Thursday, November 7th. And so Emily, if you could be so kind as to put the docket information in the chat, that would be great. That'll let RPAG members and the public follow any updates that's on the Commission's website related to that effort. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the petition, why we made that request, and also just be responsive to Public Counsel's earlier request to not just talk about sort of the petition itself, but more broadly about PSE's CETA progress to date. So we'll touch on that as well. Next slide, please. So why did PSE make a filing at the Commission to seek to lower our interim targets for 24 and 25? Really, in short, at this point, we have bought all of the long-term CETA eligible resources that we reasonably could to meet our clean energy needs out of the 2021 all-source RFP, which recently wrapped up, and all our other RFP processes to meet what are really some of our near-term clean energy goals for 24 and 25. And for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about in a minute, we're really not in a position where our original targets are achievable without going out and purchasing a significant amount of clean energy resources through the short-term market. And our current estimates that we outline at a high level in the petition is that we estimate that could come at a cost of over $200 million, not in total cost, but actually in the premium cost for those clean energy resources. And those would be additional costs to customers really to bridge that gap that we currently have for this year and next year with those short-term resources. And, you know, on the one hand, we recognize and understand that the Commission expects us to meet the interim targets that we've set out and the ones that they've approved. And at the same time, they've also indicated to us, at least through the biennial update discussion, that, you know, we are not to pursue those targets really at any cost, and certainly heard some concerns during that conversation about the potential for unreasonable costs to customers related to making some of these short-term purchases. So for PSE, when we look at the costs associated with reaching our existing approved targets, we generally feel those costs are not reasonable when you consider sort of the temporary nature of those clean energy benefits through those short-term resources, and that they're not adding sort of additional clean energy benefits to the region or to our system longer term. And I also want to mention that we think affordability is an important consideration overall as we look to make this an equitable clean energy transition for our customers. But rather than sort of make that decision unilaterally and wait until the end of the compliance period to sort of make our case to the commission of whether it was reasonable or not reasonable to go and acquire what would be, again, a significant amount of resources and cost, we made the decision that it would be more transparent to file this petition at the commission, explain the current circumstances, and really tee up the question of whether customers and interested parties think PSE should spend those additional dollars to try to meet these near-term targets, or whether others agree that, short-term market purchases potentially anticipated a cost of over 200 million are perhaps unreasonably costly and might warrant a reduction in the targets to avoid incurring those costs. So the commission, after weighing perspectives, could determine that the targets remain as they are, and then PSE would pursue making those short-term purchases and try to get as close as we possibly could to those targets, or they could, with our petition before them, agree that lowering the targets is reasonable, just in light of that additional cost. So that's the question that we're looking to tee up and have a conversation about with this filing. Next slide, please. I do see that Ezra, your hand's up. Do you want to wait a little bit till I get a little further in discussing, or do you have a question that you want to tackle right now?
I'm happy to wait.
Okay. Do you mind if I get a little bit further and then we go there?
Please
Okay.
do.
Okay. Perfect. So this slide just provides some context. I think it's review for many of you that have been along for the ride with us in our filing our first CEIP. But just maybe some review for some of you as well. We developed our initial set of interim targets back in 2021, really based on the demand forecast from the 2021 IRP, which was developed during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, where a lot of things were, as you might recall, a bit uncertain and unknown, both about what the effects would be for our loads and sort of what recovery from that might look like. We also, in planning our targets and doing that analysis, we assumed median hydro conditions, and that's consistent with the direction that's provided in the CEIP rules. And in developing our targets, we made certain assumptions about how those renewable resources would perform and contribute to the targets we were setting. And then I'll just add that the targets that we assumed in 2021, we assumed that a significant amount of new clean energy resources could be secured and online by the end of 2025, if not a bit earlier. And that was based both on, what the IRP was able to project, which again are generic resource builds, right? We've talked about that a fair bit, but it was also based at least on our early look of the bids that had come into our 2021 all source RFP process. So the potential there, we were very early, Colin can probably speak to how early. We were very early in that process, but we at least saw that we could see the range of projects that had been bid in at the time, the timelines they had proposed, but we were very early in the stages of due diligence and everything else. So that's just a little history on, and then the table on the right shows you the targets that we proposed and that are were approved by the commission in June of 2023, after we completed a rather lengthy adjudicated process that some of you were a part of. Next slide, please. So where are we now in terms of progress towards our targets? For 2022, we actually exceeded our annual target by a little bit, but in 2023, we fell short of our target by about 5%. And that we filed that as part of our informational clean energy report earlier this summer. I would say by the summer of 2023, when we were furiously working on our biennial update to file that fall, we were seeing some of the effects of lower than normal hydro in terms of some erosion of our CETA position, but we were still learning kind of how to best track kind of the variability of weather and what that meant for our progress towards our annual targets. At the point that we were doing that work, we still forecasted that by the end of 2023, we thought we were going to meet that annual target. But then what we found was that our renewable generation, particularly in the fourth quarter of 2023, as weather conditions became more erratic. That really hurt our overall percentage as where we sort of landed for the balance of the year. We did express some concern in some of these challenges when we were working on our 2023 biennial update. You may recall, we requested to lower our interim target for 2025 from 63% to 60%, and had that conversation with the commission in an open meeting. The commission ultimately just declined to adjust our target, and instead they added some condition language around cost, saying that if we had to incur, quote, unreasonably costly energy to meet our targets, that was something that they would consider at the end of the 4-year period when they were assessing our compliance. Since we filed that biennial update and had that conversation with the commission in March, the challenges we were beginning to see when we filed the biennial update last summer, or worked on it last summer, filed it in the fall, from our standpoint have worsened considerably. And so in September, we filed this petition seeking to lower our targets in 24 and 25 to 48% in both years. Those percentages of 48% were the result of some analysis we did, where we really looked at recent historical renewable performance, acknowledging that like 23 and 24 have both been lower than average hydro years, right? So we looked at the effects of lower than average hydro generation that we had sort of seen in our rearview mirror most recently, and said, okay, well, if we assume that those below average hydro conditions persist for the remainder of this year and 2025, where might we land? And our analysis in a number of ways pointed to potential that we might only reach 48% in each year. And as we know in the petition, if we have a better hydro year next year, and better than I don't know if we're going to say we'll have a normal one, but a better than last year, that'll obviously affect our percentage. So it could be, we could achieve as high as, under our estimates as 55% next year, but a lot of that is really dependent on what the weather brings, which is, as all of you know, outside of our control. As we're going to cover one more slide, and then I'm happy to stop for questions. If you go to the next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about the challenges with hydro, but just to put a finer point on it, that has had a real significant impact. Hydro has performed well below the average that we forecasted and assumed in our 2021 CEIP, approximately 22% lower for 2023. And when we looked at the first 8 months of this year, it was 34% lower. And I think when we looked at September, that trend was still continuing. Wind, solar, and biomass, not as dramatic of an underperformance, but still had an impact in 2023. And as we talked about in the biennial update as well, that load forecast we used in writing our first CEIP was developed during 2020. Our loads have grown significantly above what we originally forecasted. So that's another pressure when you think about a standard that is a percentage actually delivered to load, right? So your loads are going up, your renewable performance is not where you thought. So you're eroding your position both from the denominator and the numerator. So that can make things challenging. Couple other factors I'll mention. We're certainly seeing increased competition for clean resources. And that's what we're kind of hearing from our resource acquisition teams and our energy supply management team, whether it be for short-term clean energy resources or for longer-term resources that are being bid into our RFP processes. We're not the only utility in the region seeking clean energy. We're also not the only entity, but you all know that the tech industry also has their own ambitious climate goals, and that's creating a lot of interesting competition in the region. And we're finding that getting new resources online and permitted with the transmission that they need is just really taking longer than we anticipated when we were seeing project timelines and developing that first CEIP. I don't think any of these dynamics I'm sort of speaking to at a high level are probably new news to most of you. They're just certainly factors that have made it more challenging for utilities and for PSE in particular to meet the targets that we originally set out. And then one point I'd like to add, it's not directly in our petition, but it came out in a written response we provide to staff and other parties that I just think might be of interest to all of you is if the forecasted load that we assumed in the 21 CEIP and the existing generation had performed as we originally forecasted. So if things had played out the way we thought, so loads had been at the level we forecasted, and likewise, our resources had performed sort of under normal or median conditions, we'd be on track to meet our interim target for this year, as opposed to falling short. So all that to say, you know, despite the low growth we've seen and some of the underperformance we've seen from our hydro, we've still been working to adaptively manage what we can control in terms of our CETA position along the way. So, okay, I said a lot and I held Ezra off for a little bit. So I'd like to pause and see where I can take some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kara. And then thank you for the folks who have your cameras on. I think when we have dialogue like this, it's nice to see your faces. So let's just start with Ezra. What comment or question might you have?
Yeah, I mean, I had quite a few thoughts about this going through the presentation and then when you were just giving it. So thank you for holding me off and going through the whole thing. I mean, the first just observation is there is a disconnect between the planning requirements with the CEIP and under CETA and the performance requirements. So as you pointed out, the planning requirement is based on median hydro conditions. But of course, when you're planning to meet electricity demand, you also have to deal with uncertainty. And so you build in a margin of safety so that you know that you will actually meet energy demands, even if you have a low hydro year and higher load than expected. So I hope the PSE will seek clarification as part of this process for how to reconcile that the planning requirement, which is based on median conditions, and the requirement to actually perform and meet goals. I mean, this whole process, this is all a learning process for everyone. And so I think we've learned that this disconnect is going to show up at various times. You do find yourself in a pickle now, and certainly competing for existing resources doesn't do any additional benefit for the climate, except, of course, that competition for resources from all of the entities that you describe is what we hope will be the impact of clean energy rules, because it will drive clean energy development and ultimately drive down costs. So I guess my question is, and I don't know if this is something you can answer right now, the question is, did PSE make decisions not to procure resources because it looked like under expected conditions you were good? And what would have been the cost of procuring enough resources when it was still possible to get more from the RFPs and buy more long-term resources instead of waiting until you're sort of stuck and can only meet the goals through short-term resources? In other words, had PSE taken a different approach, would that have been how costly would that have been for customers, and what would the benefits of that have been?
Thanks for that question, Ezra. Go ahead, Kara.
No, thank you for the question. It's a good one. I mean, I'll see if Colin wants to add or clarify anything that I say, because he's been the closest to the procurement process all along. But I will say that as we've been looking at, load growth on our system, looking at how our resources are performing as compared to sort of what we planned, that hasn't been a factor in sort of slowing down our acquisition efforts. I think everything that I have heard and seen is that we've been looking for as much clean energy resources out of that procurement process as possible. We still need to meet a lowest reasonable cost standard, so it can't be, of course, at any cost. But I think more than anything, that disconnect that you started talking about, Ezra, is important. We're gonna if the question was, were you able to follow through with the plan that you laid out, that would be one question. But really, we have what we planned for, and then what actual load shows up on our system that we need to meet, and it's a percentage of load actually delivered to customers. And so, we think about sort of for this ISP process, how are we going to better plan targets in the future and account for that risk? That, of course, yes, the rules say median hydro conditions, but I think there's a little flexibility in that rule language that might mean that, you have to start by looking at median conditions, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't build in a buffer or another consideration for how you plan the targets that you propose. Colin, do you want to comment anything about sort of your observations being closely in the 2021 process? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I don't feel like you guys have slowed down your efforts to acquire clean energy as a result of sort of what the forecasting math we've been tracking.
Right. No, I think you're right, Kara, and thanks for the question, Ezra. I think there's a slide coming up that kind of shows the resource acquisitions that have been made in the years that they're made in. And I'm just thinking back to like the 2021 RP when we filed it. I think it was like 1.6 terawatt hours was the filed need. And I think we acquired, well beyond that because of load forecast changes. So yeah, I would say that it really didn't slow us down. We acquired all the feasible resources that were, diligenced and had a good risk profile for our customers. Would help us, meet targets to get to 2030 and the interim targets as well. I think there's definitely, I think Kara mentioned some of the, the challenges with transmission, interconnection, supply chain, inflation, new rules from the IRA that came out in 2022. All those were kind of contributing factors to uncertainty for resources that, resulted in adjusted pricing and sort of a moving target. So we had sort of multiple moving targets, but we did acquire some great resources and made some great progress, which I think Kara will cover in the next few slides.
Thanks, Colin and Kara. Indeed, that is coming up. Kate, did your hand go up for just a moment there?
Hit the wrong button. Don't worry about it.
Okay, great. Okay. Anyone else at this moment before we kind of allow Kara just to segue into the question of what has been acquired over the last couple of years? Okay. Well, Kara, do you want to continue with slide 18? And, we have just up until 3 o'clock for some back and forth in case anyone else has questions or comments. So go ahead, Kara.
Perfect. Yeah. So if we can go to slide 18. This slide's just here to illustrate that we've really been aggressively pursuing CETA eligible resources through a number of acquisition fronts. The all source RFP process that Colin's been directly involved in has been a really important effort, both resources acquired through that process as well as ones that have been able to occur bilaterally. There have been a number of DER specific RFPs that we've been pursuing as well. The 2022 targeted DER RFP and 2 different distributed solar and storage RFPs last year and this year, really seeking to meet our distributed solar and storage targets in our CEIP. And some of you may be familiar with our Lower Snake River wind expansion RFP, really looking to see if we can make some expansion to our existing LSR or Lower Snake River project there. And then the voluntary all source RFP, another major effort that no rest for the weary. That team wound down the 2021 all source RFP, and about the next moment they kicked off the 24 all source RFP process that Colin will talk a little bit more about. So we're actively seeking resources on all fronts, and talked about this a little bit in the integrated system plan work plan that we filed as well. Next slide, please. And so, although we are running into some challenges in meeting our target for this year and next year, it is important, and Colin mentioned this, to really step back and look at the big picture in terms of how much progress we've made in acquiring clean energy resources since CETA was enacted in 2019. So this slide just really lists some of the major CETA eligible resources we've acquired. And when you tally up these projects listed on the slide, as well as some of the short-term clean energy purchases we've done, such as purchasing hydro output, for example, we're looking at about over 3,800 megawatts of CETA eligible nameplate capacity that we've added to our portfolio since 2019. And that's really a significant amount of resources that we've secured over the last 5 years to meet CETA. And you see some of the projects, I'm sure many of you have seen like press release announcements for some of these. And this just kind of shows you the timing of when some of them are projected to come online and be in service. If there are any specific questions about these projects, I know Colin's familiar with several of them. So I'll just pause for a second, and otherwise we can keep going and come back to it as well.
Questions or comments? I dropped a link in the chat in case you want to follow up on some more of PSE's information about resource acquisition, but anything at the moment? Okay. Carry on, Kara.
Great. So next slide, if you would. So as I noted, we've made a lot of progress over the last 5 years in adding clean resources to our portfolio, but I also wanted to address what sometimes feels like the $1 million question, which is, okay, so that's great, but where is PSE in terms of meeting its 2030 objectives and beyond? So just wanted to talk a little bit about what that picture looks like. So let's focus on the table on the right for a second. These numbers are from the 2023 Electric Progress Report from last year. So know that, and these were the estimates that were included as part of the 2024 All Source RFP that Colin will talk about in a minute. So that first line, that shows what we believe to be the CETA need after conservation, which is approximately 6.3 million megawatt hours in 2030 to achieve what we need. And then from there, the second line really is aggregating together the major 2021 RFP executed projects, many of which most of which are summarized, or all, on this executed project list. They're listed in nameplate megawatts, which is a bit confusing when you need to think about megawatt hours versus megawatts, but just let's set aside the two battery projects and really focus on Vantage, Beaver Creek, Haymaker, et cetera. But those are the projects that then help us get part of the way in addressing what we need for 2030. The next line we have there is projects in progress. That's our LSR wind. I mentioned that RFP earlier. We estimate that can contribute approximately 1.7 million megawatt hours towards the CETA need. And then the number that's circled there is sort of the gap that remains for 2030 where we stand. And so from our standpoint, when you think about that CETA energy need and you think about this current voluntary all source RFP, we think that while we're in the very early stages of that procurement process, we think that is an amount that we can reasonably achieve. I also think that, and we've said this before, but I think PSE is going to be in a process of nearly continual acquisition of clean energy resources over the next several years. So the intent is for that procurement process to move more quickly than the last all source RFP did. And then, so we may be back in another year or so, starting another effort that still will hopefully give us time to contribute, should we need to do so, towards that 2030 ultimate objective. These numbers, as I noted earlier, are from last year's Electric Progress Report. And we do think that the CETA need in 2030 is likely to be higher when we think about how load may continue to grow. And so we will be updating these numbers as part of the ISP process next year. And they will be updated for the all source RFP process sometime in the spring next year, as well, as those numbers get finalized. So this is just the most recent numbers, published numbers we have, and just wanted to kind of give you a sense of perspective of where we currently sit. I'll also note that 6.3 million megawatt hours is really about that CETA clean energy need. It's not, sometimes it's not including some of the capacity that we may also need in 2030 to maintain our system. So it's really focusing on the clean energy need in particular. Yeah. I'll just pause there because there may be some questions.
Kate, I see Kate's hand. Go ahead.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Not an accident this time. I had two questions about this slide. The first is curious if you could translate the units on these tables, perhaps the energy megawatt hours in this table on the right. Is there a way that you could explain that in terms of nameplate capacity so that it matches the table on the left. I guess I'm just trying to, and maybe
I
I'm just
know.
reading this poorly, but trying to gauge the difference there. And then I'm going to just ask my second question because it's related, which is I see that this table on the right is based on the 2023
Yes.
electricity progress report. And I was curious if the demand forecasted in that report is still on target or based off of the demand forecast you've been seeing, if you think that that would need to be kind of changed somewhat dramatically.
Thanks, Kate. I might take your second question first, just knowing that when we prepared our petition, we did sort of take a quick look at, okay, how is, as we were looking at actuals and trying to arrive at sort of what would be a proposed change to the targets, we wanted to see how that compared to the electric progress report. And I would say it was fairly close. That doesn't mean though, when the load forecast gets updated again as part of this ISP process, and we have this conversation in 2025, that we won't be seeing some load growth. I think we very well might. But when we took that initial look, it was fairly close. So we felt like that was useful to consider. And that's why in our petition, we made comparisons to the 21 CIP, but we also made comparisons to the biennial update that used the electric progress report. Now, your first question was about the crosswalk. And I had the same sort of reaction when this information was provided to me, because it's just not easy to sort of knit between one and knit it back and forth and crosswalk it. The megawatt hours really are factoring in the capacity value of these nameplate resources. So how many megawatt hours do we really need to achieve an 80%, which is different than just thinking about the nameplate. If it was hydro, that nameplate would be a lot closer versus for some of these wind facilities, that capacity value, as you know, is lower. And so the megawatt hours is what we really, especially in our internal tracking, we pay a lot of attention to, because that's ultimately what we need to be able to achieve. But the nameplate, I think, helps us understand a bit of scale for some of us like me that are a little less technical, to get a sense of like, okay, that's 100 megawatts of wind over here. That generally looks like X, but we can get you a better sort of crosswalk between the two of the math, because I certainly did check in with my team to make sure that this aligned properly before we included it. So if that would be helpful, I'm happy to do that.
Tara, do you mean capacity factor?
Excuse me. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for that back and forth. And I see Elisa's hand.
Okay, I was having trouble unmuting, so sorry about that. Yeah, Kara, you mentioned that this does not include capacity needed for resource adequacy, right?
Or not all of it, I should say. I should have been more precise. The number that we put out pretty consistently has been to the tune of 6,700 megawatts needed in 2030. That's been kind of from the electric progress report what we've put out there. And I will pause to see if anyone from the IRP team wants to kick me under the virtual table, but that's my understanding. So a lot of this, of course, does help with capacity, but just trying to distinguish the numbers, because it can get confusing.
Yeah, because I think when you say 6,700 megawatts, and I guess what I'm trying to understand is that's more, I don't know, ELCC, not quite nameplate, right? But how does that translate to the 18? So here I see about 2,000 megawatts executed or in progress. So that's your 2,800 or 2,800,000, 900,000, and the 1.7 million megawatt hours. You know, those last two. I guess my question is, have more been acquired, or are you still saying you need another? If it were nameplate, you know, the difference between the 1885, let's just say, and 6,700. It's really hard to kind of relate what that 6,700 megawatts is. You get my point? Like, can you explain that more clearly?
I do, but I might have to see if if I've got someone on the line from the team that can jump in and help me a little bit with just explaining it better than I did, or I might need to follow up with you separately, Lisa. I know that we've definitely had these conversations prior, but I can recognize that this is a little bit confusing in how it's laid out.
Well, I guess maybe my first question, maybe I can break it down a little differently. Have you acquired some of that 6,700 megawatts? Like, is that this, or, you know?
Yes.
And
yes,
I think it's better, and like how you show how you've acquired this you only need now 1.7 million megawatt hours, right? Maybe can you give an indication of how much of that 6,700 megawatts is still needed?
I'm going to see if Elizabeth is able to jump in and help me a little bit with this, because I know she was a lot closer to these numbers, but and if not, I might need to follow up with you separately, Lisa, but
Okay.
let's see.
That's fine.
Yeah, in terms of the effective peak capacity, so based off of the winter peak, the 16,700 was the normal peak plus the planning margin. That's where that number is. So the net need between the resources was about 2,000 megawatts of a need by 2029. I think it was what we had in the 23 progress report. So with the nameplate, what we would do is take the nameplate, multiply by the effective capacity. So those are the ELCC percents. So each of these resources get a different ELCC based off of the 23 progress report. So that's all listed in our resource adequacy chapters, the different effective capacities. So that's kind of how it translates to those peak needs. I think that helps.
Does that help?
You would take these these nameplates by their times their ELCCs to how they contribute. But I think what I'm maybe missing here is the understanding of, you know, how maybe what is where the 6,700 starts and what's been acquired for it. I'm still a little confused by that.
Yeah, Philip, do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, just real quick. You know, what I kind of envision would be helpful here, listening to this conversation, is like a table that has kind of two columns. One which is the capacity need, and then the resources that we have, and then the open position. The same thing on the non-emitting energy position, right? Kind of like here's the need to hit 80%, and then here's the resources that we have, kind of so that you'd be able to see both of those components, right? And yes, some resources may fill some of them, but if you see them side by side, you'd see how much capacity is left to fill, how much non-emitting energy is left to fill. That was kind of my takeaway. It would be probably helpful to have one table kind of shows all that kind of explanation, right? Because the 6,700 from the IR or for the progress report is helpful, but it's, you know, actual results may vary. If you get different resources, you won't need the 6,700. Maybe it'd be better to just show, like I said, that the remaining open position might be a helpful way to show that.
Yeah, that I think there's some, you know, chatter about what PSE really needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a little unclear, and recognizing that PSE, you know, what you acquire will change that, but that open position remaining, I think, is just a little bit hard to get that idea of the progress that you've made also for resource adequacy or not, or where there's still that gap, because obviously you have to the expectations to acquire clean energy, because that will affect your CETA targets too, the amount of emitting resources versus load that you have. So I think just a better, I think it's a little unclear right now, and so if you could help paint that picture a little more, that would be beneficial. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Well, one of the reasons why I love this picture, this view, is because, you know, when you compare that to the resources that took us 100 years to accumulate, this is a massive push, right? It took us 100 years to get to where we were, right? And now we're just adding, we just added 1,245 megawatts to that. So it's a big push, but I think we can kind of work on that kind of a view of the open position,
Yeah.
which we would be doing for the ISP here anyway. So, yeah. but I think that would be really helpful.
I know that Kara has a couple more slides, and we want to leave time for Jen. So can I ask Kara for you to wrap up the pieces, and then we can have one more quick back and forth before we let Jen have her moment.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thanks for the feedback. And we'll work on a clearer picture. Like we just had that discussion. That's really helpful. Next slide, please. I think this might be where I'd like to briefly turn it over to Colin to talk just a little bit about what we're seeing in the 2024 all-source RFP. Thanks, Colin.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kara. So we did get a good, robust response to the voluntary RFP. Pretty similar, honestly, to the 2021 RFP response. So in 2021, I think we got 95 proposals. This time we got 98 resource proposals. We do see some differences in the resource mix. There's quite a few batteries that are being proposed. You can see there's over 40 proposals for batteries, predominantly on PSE's system, so our transmission system. And we do have a good mix of variable energy resources, so clean energy resources. And so if we think about the prior slide and the 1.6 terawatt hour remaining need for CETA, we do think that it's achievable with this resource proposals that were submitted through the RFP. It's probably going to be challenging, similar to the last RFP, but we think that there is really some tailwinds for us for this next RFP. Just thinking about like what challenges we had in 2021 RFP. Supply chain does seem to be stabilizing a little bit, and developers have acquired long lead equipment and are kind of inventorying long lead equipment to shift around to different projects that are the most promising. So that's good. Inflation seems to have stabilized a bit. The IRA, the rules for the Inflation Reduction Act, I think are better understood now, which helps. That uncertainty with things like domestic content was something that slowed down the process. In the end, is going to be very beneficial with the bonus credits for tax incentives. And although competition is still definitely a factor, so PSE is going to try to move pretty rapidly to acquire resources in this RFP, and we have a tighter timeline. So I think publicly we've mentioned that we're going to try to wrap up RFP by the end of Q2 next year, and so that's what we're targeting. And to date we're on track. We just moved through our phase one, what we call it. We have a two-phase process. So we moved through our phase one process to reduce the number of bids to just kind of a subset that's more promising. And so we'll now go into the phase two process, where we're going to be doing deeper due diligence and starting negotiations with developers. So
thanks.
Stop there and see any questions.
Yeah. I know a number of RPAG members want to have a conversation, so maybe Kara, just quickly wrap up your slide and then we can have some good dialogue.
Sure. Before I move on, it looked like there was one question related to Colin's slide in the chat. Do you want to take that now, or do you want to come back? It was from Joel. I don't know if you saw it. Sorry, you're on mute, Sophie.
Thank you. I did miss that one. Let's focus on that one. So Joel asks, are all of these 2024 all-source RFP resources to be online before 2030?
Yes, so that was one of the requirements of the RFP. So any projects that they have to be online before January 1, 2030. So that was a requirement in the RFP. So the projects that we're looking at now do have CODs, commercial operation dates before 2030. And, some of them are kind of clustered in 28, 29, but they are before 2030.
Thanks for that. All right, Kara, go ahead.
Great. So I will try to wrap quickly in case there are any more questions and knowing we've got more on the agenda. So if you can go to the next slide. Colin, thanks for walking through that. Just wanted to recap, but I won't belabor the point. We certainly continue to cultivate a pipeline of resources that can help meet our goals. And Colin just talked about our most recent RFP. And it's also just worth acknowledging that we're actively pursuing and growing our customer resources as well through energy efficiency, demand response, and customer-owned solar and storage. And so at this point, we've talked about a lot of the progress that we've made since 2019, and we believe that we can continue to make progress, particularly as we get closer to 2030. But also just a bit of a cautionary note that our optimism on our pathway to 2030, it could change if the challenges we're seeing grow as we progress throughout the decade. But for now, we certainly see a pathway forward and we remain committed to getting there. So I hope that this presentation was helpful. And if there are more questions, we'll see if we can take them now or later offline.
Yeah, let's have another 5 minutes or so. I know that this is important to a number of people on the call. So let's do Katie.
Hi, thanks, Kara, for walking us through all of this. I may have missed this, but I'm curious, are you expecting to fill the open position for the 2030 target with this RFP alone, or will it take future RFPs before 2030?
I think that remains to be seen. I think that we are hopeful that we may be able to get a lot of progress through this current all source RFP. And Colin, I don't know if you want to speak to that more directly, because we're kind of in the early stages of that RFP, but I think there's some potential there. And I think we also acknowledge that, like I mentioned previously, I think we're going to be in somewhat continual procurement processes for a while. So I think if we aren't able to get all the way there with this RFP, there's also the opportunity, I think, in 25 to, engage in a similar effort to fill any gaps that we have.
Yeah,
sorry, Colin, I gave you an opportunity and then I kept going.
No, I think that's right,
Sorry.
Kara. I think, we are in the early stages of evaluating projects for this RFP, but, we're encouraged by what we received. And I think Kara noted earlier that LSR, the expansion of that is a pretty big number too that contributes to CETA. So we're working hard on that as well. So between the RFP, LSR expansion, we're hopeful we can be in pretty good shape for the 2030 target.
Thanks.
Great. Anybody else? Ezra, go ahead.
Always happy to jump in if there's space available. I was just, thinking back to what we were discussing earlier and the goals and your cautious optimism. It seems to me that it might have been useful had the goals, and maybe they were, and I just am not aware of it, maybe they weren't contextualized in terms of, these goals are based on the following assumptions. You don't have as much flexibility with that, obviously, with the 2030 goal, which is pretty set in, well, if not in stone, at least in CETA. But I think it would be helpful when you talk about being optimistic, but maybe not, to just be a little clearer about what you see as the risks and what would be the impact of those risks.
Yeah, thank you, Ezra. That's a good observation. I think, as you noted earlier in this conversation, I think we all have learned a lot through this first CEIP process and expected to. And so that's certainly coloring our thinking as we think about what future targets may look like leading up to 2030 and beyond that as well. So it's a great point.
Yeah. And so, Fred, let's wrap with you. Let's hear your question, comment, and make sure we have enough time to hear from you.
Yeah, first, quick question going back to slide 16. It fell short in 23. If somebody has that percentage readily available, it would be helpful to know that. If not, fine. But then I have a comment on that and then a broader comment.
Fred, I think your internet was cutting out. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, just if I wonder if anybody knows what those percentages were in 22 and 23.
The original target or where we landed? Sorry, you were breaking up for me too.
Yeah, both the original target and the amount that Puget achieved.
Yeah, can we flip back to just a couple to one of my earlier slides? It shows the 4 targets. If you would, it probably want to, yeah. So yeah, we landed in pretty close to 48, 49%. It was around 48 for 2023. Like I mentioned, that wasn't where our outlook was for a good part of the year, but Q4 and our hydro performance really eroded that position. And I might need to phone a friend on the final number for 2022. I want to say it was 45.5%, but we've made some small adjustments. So that's pretty close, but I can follow up with you, Fred, on the exact numbers.
Right. No, that's fine. I don't need anything direct. That really addresses it. But I think it would be helpful, going forward in future reports and definitely in the IRP filing to list out, each year and what the target was and, what Puget achieved, both, the historical aspect of that and then projecting going forward, obviously, with the annual targets to give context to everybody to what's really going on. So I think that would be helpful. Let me make a quick comment on the overall issue of the target and Puget's recommendation to drop it short run down to 48%. Yes, we certainly recognize, and thank you for presenting all the background and context for this. We certainly recognize the hydro deficit is a major issue. This is not entirely unpredictable, but I think that, it has a big effect on the regional surplus available for Puget in the market, among other things. So that's a very significant issue. And also decreases, less hydro means less flexibility on the system, which is what we saw in January and July, both. The second issue, you mentioned large load. I think this is an issue we should dig into somewhere in the future, specifically with data centers and large industrial loads. Should we rethinking how resources are acquired along with those loads coming onto the system? Third, although I didn't hear you mention it directly, obviously transmission constraints are a big factor here. And finally, one more, which I think is going to be very important, which is additional pressure on both price and deliverability for natural gas. The Kitimat LNG Canada terminal is ready to open. It will start shipping commercial quantities within a couple months, and I anticipate they will be fully in operation probably in the first quarter next year. 2 billion cubic feet a day of exports out of our region, which is going to put a lot more pressure on prices at Sumas, where you get a lot of your gas, and potentially on deliverability in tight conditions. So this is another challenge that's out there right now in terms of achieving the targets. And finally, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the Western Resource Adequacy Program. Although that could be beneficial, it could also be, it's going to be complicated to figure that out. So I would say one positive thing that you showed was the very high market readiness in terms of not the power market, but the supply of resources, and getting almost 100 bids in each RFP round. Very diverse. A lot of them are very, very cost effective. But I also recognize, there's really serious money involved. A lot of technical and business processes that Puget has to manage to acquire those resources. So those high investment levels also mean elevated, but I would say manageable risks. So it's important, for you to keep letting us know what's happening with all those pieces as we follow your RFP processes. Finally, and we're not going to give comments today about the 48% directly, just to say we will be submitting more detailed comments to the commission. But broadly speaking, I think our view is we want Puget to take truly, all efforts to do best efforts on this whole approach. I think we all recognize that, we can't predict the future. When CETA passed, a lot of really good work went into that, but we're addressing things now in real time or near future time that could not be anticipated. All the same, those targets were set in a really thorough process, and we want to make sure that as much progress can be made as possible.
Thank you for those comments, Fred. Any final remarks from PSE in response to Fred before we allow Jen to continue?
I was just going to say thank you, Fred, for those observations. I think those are all good things for us to be thinking about and communicating about as we move forward. So thank you.
Great. Well, good dialogue, everyone. It seems like this group is really engaged and informed. Joel, is this something that could wait, or is this just I'm getting sensitive about time. Yeah.
Sure, fair enough. Yeah, no, I just wanted to highlight, I posted a comment in the chat, just if there are any questions or thoughts, or anyone wants to engage in the docket for this petition from PSC, feel free to reach out to me. So drop a link to the docket, which is the same as the 2021 CEIP docket, UE 210795.
Fantastic.
So feel free to get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel, for providing that as an additional avenue for members to get engaged with this topic. So with that, Will, can you advance a couple slides here? I'm going to turn it over to Annie, who will introduce Jen.
Thanks, Sophie. All right, so I'm going to get us dove right into our next topic here without taking up too much time. So we have about 30 minutes or so to first hear from Jennifer Colson, who is PSE's Operation and Gas Analysis Manager, and answer questions about the scenario framing. Before we dive into an interactive mural activity with folks, Jennifer is going to review ISP scenario information and take those questions for several minutes, and then I'll use the last 10 minutes or so for that activity, and we'll provide you the link once we get there. While Jennifer presents, please go ahead and feel free to raise your hand, put your questions in the chat. I'm going to pause at 2 key points. One will be after the next slide, and then once we get to the end of her slides, just to be mindful of time. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jennifer to take us through her slides.
Great, thanks, Annie. So yeah, switching topics a bit on scenarios. And so before we dive into that, and really what we're going to discuss today is reframing how we think about scenarios for our first ISP. They will be a little bit different than we have in IRPs past. But before we do that, it's always helpful to start with the timeline. So this is the timeline from the last RPAG meeting in September. It's busy, there's a lot going on, and just a few key things to call out on this timeline is the inputs close date of Q2 of 2025, and then we have draft results coming out early Q3 of 2026. And through the feedback process, we received some comments regarding concerns about having stale data because of the inputs close being at the end of Q2 of 2025. And we hear you and we understand your concerns, but when we think about the overall timeline of the ISP and where the feedback is really helpful and meaningful in this process, it's really in that draft portfolio, especially for our first ISP, right? This is a big change. It's a big scope, and we really want to make sure we're doing the best that we can. And so we believe that this timeline is really important to ensure that we can get those draft results out earlier in the process to ensure that we can actually incorporate some level of feedback from this group and the public along the way. And if you recall, prior IRP processes are roughly 2 years, and we've always had a challenge with getting those draft results out earlier, because each time it seems like the process gets more and more the modeling gets more and more complicated, and it takes more and more time. And so it doesn't allow for that feedback on the back end that we all really strive to have. So I'll pause for a second. Is there any concerns or questions on this?
Thanks, Jennifer. Questions so far from folks before we get into the rest of the slides? All right, I'm not seeing any, so you can keep going, Jennifer, and then we'll pause at the end for more questions.
Sounds good. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to talk about kind of quickly just where we were with scenarios from prior IRPs past, right? And when we looked forward to an ISP, we're looking kind of similar, but I'll talk about some key differences that we're framing up. So in prior IRPs, we've leveraged current policies, laws, external feedback, customer needs, and clean energy goals to really establish scenarios. And when we think of scenarios, We are talking about different economical, political, futures, new worlds, if you will, scenarios where several factors are changing within a certain scenario. And so we've had reference cases and scenarios 1, 2, 3 plus, right, in prior IRPs. And then we had sensitivities, which were taking the reference case and changing one aspect of that reference case to really test the robustness of that portfolio and or test different things that are of interest to maybe PSE, stakeholders, et cetera, and determining what impact would that have on that reference case. And out of all of that, through our external engagement, through our internal conversations, we would develop one preferred electric portfolio, one preferred gas portfolio, which would then either highlight a need for additional resources or not, and that would kick off that all source RFP process that Kara and Colin were just kind of talking about from this last iteration. So if we go to the next slide, when we think about an ISP, the process is getting more complex. We're expanding the scope of this ISP to include numbers of different infrastructures, the gas and electric pipelines and energy supply. And so we think it's really important that these scenarios that we're developing for this ISP are more realistic in nature and think about outcomes that may occur over the next 5-10 years as we develop this ISP. We're also looking at framing these scenarios as more of bookends. So considering within the conditions that we are experiencing today, how low could that go and how high could that go? And it's to ensure that we're getting that range of potential futures considerations on those bookends. And this will help inform and develop that gas and electric implementation and action plan and ensure that PSE is evaluating risk across those different scenarios for different investment opportunities. And I'll explain that more in a minute. So next slide is really taking that first IRP slide, but kind of adding an ISP lens to it. So what essentially we're saying with this bookend, and again, I have another slide that kind of articulates this again in a different way, because we all learn differently. We have these scenarios and these reference cases, and we're thinking of them as bookends, different versions of the world, and they're all going to come together. And we're going to look across the scenarios to make a decision on what that CEIP, CEAP will be within that ISP. We're not picking a preferred plan per se. And I'll explain that and why. And so on the next slide, here's kind of how we're framing it, a different visual. So we have the reference case there and we have scenarios, right? And they're going to range from a high load to a low load. This is encompassing of gas and electric. So they may be complementing one another. In a high load, that may be low or negative or really negative gas growth, right? High electrification. Then we have a low load electric growth. Maybe that's low electric growth. Maybe that's zero gas growth, but sustaining, or maybe that's still negative gas growth, right? There's a lot of potential opportunities here. And what we're doing is looking across those scenarios and thinking about the range of potential investments as I look over those scenarios. And it's not so much about where I land on the curve, but really about what are the risks and mitigation plans for those potential future and outcomes that PSE doesn't have control over, RPAG doesn't necessarily have control over, right? That's just economics, it's just how things outline. So what are the range of potential options and what would those investments look like? So on the next slide, oh, sorry, I forgot it was animated. Yeah, so this is, what's the risk and how would PSC mitigate that? So and then on the next slide, we're really thinking of this ISP in 3 buckets. So we have the clean energy implementation plan, we have the clean energy action plan, and then we have this theoretical future. And in prior RFPs, right, we pick a preferred plan that would go from year 1 all the way through year 20. And we'd actually use the first 4 years of that for the clean energy implementation plan, the first 10 for the clean energy, or 5 through 10 for the clean energy action plan, and then the years 11 through 20 were just part of that preferred plan. And what we're saying with this scenario bookend idea is it kind of helps with that stale data and that mitigation and concern, because I'm really planning for all potential future opportunities, but I'm not picking one, and I recognize and acknowledge the fork in the road. At some point, things are going to diverge from the plan, and that's okay because the future is unknown, but what I'm doing is setting myself up to mitigate those longer term investment and risks and bring them to influence the near term actions. And there's a little note, because obviously these timelines are pending rulemaking, so don't get married to these dates. So next slide. And this is just a way of like kind of illustrating specifically what I'm referring to. This is just an example and is from the 23 gas IRP. It's just a nice visual that really kind of helped articulate this idea. So these are two snapshots on two different timeframes. So the first one is like winter of 2040, and the second one on the second portion of this graph is winter of 2050. You can see that the scenarios and all the sensitivities from that gas IRP are listed, and then they're all stacked and they're showing you the different investments for each scenario or sensitivity along the way. And what is really helpful and interesting to me is when you look across the scenarios and sensitivities, you can see that the yellow square is there in almost every single one, right? Or the red one is there every time and the green one is there every time. So if green and red show up in every single possible sensitivity, that seems like for PSC's customers and for PSC, that seems like a very good investment to make, because in every opportunity, so again, think of this as the bookend scenarios, pretend these are the new ones, you'd be evaluating those different risks and maybe those investments make sense. Whereas, oh, yellow doesn't show up once, so let's dive into that. Let's understand why that doesn't show up and what's the risk of investing in that and what's the risk of not investing in that and what would that mean for us. So it's kind of just a way to illustrate the bookend idea and how we lay this out in different timeframes. Okay, so next slide. So when we look at this time frame again, I think concerns we've heard through different forums is how are you using the 20 years to influence the near-term actions, right? And so we see that the future years 11 through 28 do have a big impact on our 5 to 10 and 1 to 4 year time horizon. So we would evaluate each scenario. It have a list of investments for each planning function, right, across the board, out over that long time frame. And maybe there's a resource that's identified in year 15 of a scenario, and maybe it comes up in every scenario, and that resource may have a long lead time. So like a transmission line, I think we talked about that earlier. Like if we need transmission to bring wind home from Montana or something, that's a very long years lead time, right? So if that's identified in year 15 in every scenario, then it seems like a pretty good idea that we should start that process, and by whatever means that is. And that's probably entering a cluster study, creating this regional study on transmission, right? And there's actions that we could be taking in the near term that would allow us to kick off that process. And then for the next ISP, whatever the rules define that ISP timeframe to be, assuming we have another one, we'd reevaluate that investment again and confirm, okay, now that we've got new bookends or updated ones, does that investment still make sense? And how would we mitigate or change those plans? So hopefully that's helpful. I have a note on here about equity. It's represented within each one. So I know I didn't talk about that specifically today, but I just wanted to call it out that we are still planning to do equity in every aspect of the plan. Any questions?
Thanks, Jennifer. And
any
any questions from folks? Not seeing any so far.
Okay, it's probably a change. It takes a second. So the next slide, I think, is just, why we think it's important. So this will help ensure we have alignment across the Clean Energy Implementation Plan and the Clean Energy Action Plan across the gas and electric utilities. It allows those long-term assumptions to be assumptions. We don't know what will happen, but it's a really good way to create robustness in our plans for PSE and our customers. And it allows us to focus on those near-term actions, mitigating risk for long-term potential impacts. And the reason we bring it up is, as the timeline showed you, we do need to figure out what the scenarios are going to be before the conclusion of the year here, or I think early next year, to start this process. We're kicking off analysis, and we need to define these for all the different planning teams that are going to get started. So that is kind of why I wanted to frame it. Is there questions on the framing before we dive into like hearing from you guys on what the scenario should be?
see Joel's hand and then Megan. So Joel, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess I want to know, and I think you already mentioned that we're in an awkward phase where we have to get going on an ISP before we've actually defined what an ISP is in the rulemaking. I just want to acknowledge that, and extend, as I often do, an invitation to anyone here to get involved with that process. I'll put the docket number in chat. It's U2 40281 for anyone interested in that. But I did have a question. One of these slides. I'm gonna go back and see where it was. Oh, so you talk about setting up the scenarios as bookends. I guess I mean in past planning cycles I've seen that happen, and testing what high gas prices and low gas prices and expected gas prices, or the same for maybe different load scenarios. But you didn't talk specifically about what the bookends are trying to bracket within. Is it gas prices? Or are we talking about load? If so, I mean, I think you mentioned gas and electric load and play there, but maybe if you could expand on what you're thinking about for these scenarios and what you're trying to bracket.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Good clarification. We on the mirror board we kind of have it outlined, but to answer your question, we're thinking of load scenarios. So a high load scenario where electrification, a higher electrification load versus a lower electrification load, and then considerations for the gas utility across those different options or different scenarios would be what we're looking at for a range of different emissions profiles.
Thanks, Jennifer. And thank you for that question. I have Megan up next.
Hi, I actually had a very similar question to Joel. It's about the bookends, and I was wondering if you're viewing these scenarios as really factors kind of outside of PSE's control, so such as policy factors that would influence, customer electrification and therefore decreased gas load, or are you also taking into account some of PSE's programs that, I know in 1589 there may be some low income electrification programs coming out of that. Are you incorporating some of those programs that PSE could implement to possibly affect load, or are you really looking at external factors?
Good question. So it's probably a little bit of both as you think about it. So electrification specifically is probably the thing that we're seeing as a key driver in these scenarios in the bookends and the range of potential volume of load shifting, right, that we see there. And then for any existing programs that PSE is currently running, that would be incorporated into the existing load forecast, right? For any potential future programs, I think that would come out of this analysis within the ISP and be identified as an opportunity to pursue.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so it looks like that's a wrap on questions for now, Jennifer. So thank you so much for sharing all that information. And now we're going to segue into the mural activity, if that's okay. So we will be sharing screen. Will's going to share the mural activity board that we're going to be working from. So whenever you get that chance, Emily, if you could also provide the link to the mural board in the chat for RPAG members. And so RPAG members, note that when you click on the link, you can enter as a visiting goat or elephant or whatever animal that pops up for you today, or you can go ahead and type your name if you prefer not to remain anonymous. But once you're in the mural board, you can easily double click on a virtual post-it note and start typing your feedback on the various topics, and I'll take you through what we're going to do. So first and foremost, the goal of this activity is to have RPAG members engage, really by confirming and adding factors on that left-hand column, and then helping to complete the values across the scenarios. For example, low electric demand reference case and high electric demand, just as Jennifer was speaking to. So I'm going to take us through this activity in 2 stages. First, we're going to start with giving you all about 3 minutes of quiet time on your own to review the factors on the left-hand side, and ask you to note if this is a comprehensive list or if you are suggesting additional factors. So feel free to add information directly onto the mural, or you can make your own notes. After the 3 minutes is up, I'm going to go ahead and ask folks to share their feedback verbally. And then once those factors conversation is wrapped up, we're going to move on to filling in the values under each scenario. I'll pause and give you another few minutes to start this on your own during some quiet time, and then come off mute and volunteer your insights, your predictions, and encourage some discussion amongst each other for the factors. So Emily, if you don't mind putting those instructions in the chat so everybody has access to those. Anybody have questions about the approach before we start getting going? Yeah, Fred. Fred, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if your internet.
Wasn't sure if you called on me.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
I've used Mural, but we've used Mural before. I've used it for other purposes. Good,
okay.
Good app. But I'm wondering, will we have a chance to really sit down and consider this, or are you just getting our immediate feedback on the fly?
Sure, that'd be a great question, I think, for Jennifer.
Yeah, no, great question, Fred. So this is just meant to be an interactive conversation with the RPAG. We're really hoping to have some dialogue with you guys and sets out like some details here. We have the feedback report after the meeting, and we're really interested in as much feedback as you can provide. So this is definitely not the last
yeah, I have to say,
yeah.
Even though I'm try to be kind of up on all this IRP stuff, this is the sort of thing that really you have to think through all the pieces. Okay, what's been left out? What do we want to emphasize? And just rushing into it like this, I'm not really feeling ready for it.
Yeah, that's understandable. Hopefully this will prompt some thoughts for you.
And you'll have you'll go ahead, Annie.
No, go for it, Sophie.
I think you all will come back to this in December, so fill out that doodle poll. So this is not the last time, Fred, you're going to talk about this. And I believe you have a week, if you want, with the feedback report, just to allow you to sit with your colleagues and give this some extra thought.
Perfect. And we can provide, you can keep the link in your browser, and we can give it to RPAG members afterwards too, if you want to keep adding to it. All right, so note that we have used different colors for different factors to keep things just a bit more visually clear, and that the gas factors are a teal color and all electric are light red in color. And then Jennifer, before we get started, I was going to see if you wanted to provide a few examples that might get people's wheels turning before we start that first 3 minutes of quiet time for people to talk about or think about factors on their own.
Definitely. Yeah, so as Annie walked you through, there's the factors on the left, and these are just things that stuck out to us as things that would really drive load changes within the gas and the electric utility. So that's kind of where we were thinking. There's obviously a ton of other details, as you mentioned, gas prices, et cetera, that we would also provide for each of these scenarios. But really what we're after is those big load shifting assumptions that we would have. Across the top is the demand, right? We have the low and then a reference and a high. Don't consider that to be too limiting. It was really just to help frame up this exercise. So if you're thinking a high load there's a few options for high load and different drivers that you think are important, please call those out in those little squares. It's not meant to be prescriptive in that way. So an example for the high load that is helpful when we think about residential electrification, when we say high, that could mean a couple of different things to different people. And so one option would be you're looking at electrification on equipment burnout, or you're looking at electrification where you're pulling out appliances before they need to be replaced. Are we looking at electrification where we're electrifying the whole home at the exact same time, or are we electrifying appliances as each appliance burns out, right? Those are like 4 different examples of how you could look at high electrification. So things like that is what we're kind of looking for your guys' thoughts and considerations on, and what you think is a good approach for this bookend analysis for this ISP, and how to ensure that we're really considering all the different risks and different potential futures for the company and for our customers.
Great. Super helpful explanation, Jennifer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on mute, and I'm not sure if Will is going to play music, but we're going to give you all about 3 minutes of quiet time with or without music. We'll find out. And so you can really think about this left-hand column. Are these the correct factors to have listed here? Are there any additional ones that you see missing that need to be included? And I'll go ahead and start that 3 minutes now. Thanks, everyone. All right. Well, I don't know about you, but I had to really restrain myself from dancing on camera. So you know this is live streamed. But I saw all the visiting animals floating around. So I saw a couple of things getting added down to the other. I don't want to assume that means agreement with all of the factors above. So, but would love to hear what folks think. If you wanted to take yourself off mute or raise your hand and share whether or not you think those factors resonate with you and why maybe those post-its are being added down below. And maybe I'll call on, okay, Katie, yes, saw your hand pop on.
Hi, thanks. And this is really more of a question than anything else, but I'm just curious if there's a reason that I guess only residential electrification is called out, and could that be building electrification more generally? But maybe that's just a gap in my own knowledge. Thanks.
Jennifer, would that be a question for you?
Yeah, sorry, the sun. I'm not used to this space.
No worries.
Residential electrification, I think it was probably just, it can be all inclusiving. I think we were just focused on residential because that's where a lot of the impact is on some of this stuff, but we'll consider CNI and other customers as well in the ISP. So I think it's a good call out. Thank you.
Okay, great. I just added that note there. Yeah, Alisa?
Yeah, I'm just, my mind has been focused on transmission a lot lately. So, I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about scenarios, and I'm thinking about interaction, but you know, how other factors sort of outside of load and electrification, adoption, like might influence the outcomes to like transmission and what kind of expansion we might see over the 20-year period. How does that fit in? I'm kind of maybe a little where Fred is. Maybe I'm often, you know, where I'm not quite ready or I'm in left field. So with what you asked.
Yeah, and Jennifer, would that be for you?
Yes, and sorry, admittedly, someone was helping with the blinds. And so you're talking about the load for electrification and the impacts on regional transmission and the drive there. Was your question, Elisa?
Well, not so much. I mean, is this just, are you really just wanting us to focus on load impacts? I guess I'm just trying to think about, yeah, maybe I just kind of missed that one point, you know, being late in the afternoon and back to back in meetings. This is all just about load and factors affecting load.
It's a good call out. So when we think about the scenarios in the ISP, because of the breadth of this ISP, when we really wanted to focus these scenarios on load, because that's really the driving factor for the level of investment across the different planning groups for infrastructure that's needed. However, there is that lovely little sensitivities box, right, where you're validating the robustness of each specific planning function on different factors that we need to consider and test out. So to your question, Elisa, like a sensitivity on Aurora could be limitations on regional transmission or you know, those sorts of things. So that's still there. And if you have ideas on that, like feel free to put them on here. Like all feedback is accepted. This was really just focused on those load sensitivities or scenarios, I'm sorry, for the ISP just because of the timeline. So feel free to add either, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you for helping me just zero in on what your real intent was here, but you know, what other could mean. Thank you.
Thanks. And I see some folks have added some post-its down below in the other category, building electrification more generally. Is there a reason only electrification is called out? Is one we already talked about, and then expanded HVDC transmission system, low, medium, high. Where does this go? And sorry for my ignorance, can you please explain what HVDC is?
High voltage direct current, but it could be just high voltage or other, you know, high voltage transmission. The large pipes across the West and the US.
The long distance.
Long distance. And high capacity.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we have a number of hands up. I'm going to go to Ezra next.
Thanks. Yeah, so on the load question, I mean, it's sort of, I don't know why we're only looking at electric load for all of these. And it also isn't clear. I mean, it says demand. I think we're talking about both peak load and annual energy in terms of impacts. And I guess on Katie's point, I think it's not just even building electrification in general, end use electrification, like industrial processes. Like there's lots of potential that could be pursued there that should also be considered in the scenarios.
Agree. Yeah, and we went back and forth on how to frame up the columns to not make it confusing, but so we added rows. So customer load growth gas and customer load growth electric was intended to help clarify within those different columns what you think may be important to evaluate. And again, they're not exclusive. There could be multiple scenarios within the low side and the high side for the bookend, so don't take it that way. The DR demand response, yes, I think both apply. So whichever you add is appropriate. It's really open. So
okay, so we sort of interested in both electric and gas demand.
Yeah, demand response. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, thanks, Joel, or sorry, thanks, Ezra. And then I had Megan, I know your hand went back down. Did you still have a question? And then I have Joel.
I did, but then it got answered in some way. But I have another quick point I wanted to make, which is it would be great to see markets included in here as well. And if there's increased load on the electrical grid from customers outside of PSE who would influence this ISP for PSE, just based on the market and electrical prices and things like that. And I didn't see that included here, so.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, and then I had Joel's hand up too.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess maybe an observation, but I think this group is primarily kind of focused on like the traditional IRP resource planning type effort prior to the switch toward the ISP. And I think there are things within the ISP that are coming up now about delivery system impacts that are really important to capture also. And it sort of if you're just thinking about resources and loads and not so much about what's going on between those, I think the bookends make a lot of sense in that stress to those resources based on like new loads of electrification, transportation electrification. They lend themselves well to the kind of how this mural is, the impression this mural is giving me about the bookends that PSE is trying to set in these scenarios. But things like distributed generation, demand response fit a little bit less neatly, and then even more so with some of the investments that I think Eliza is bringing up about transmission and how different assumptions within the reference or these bookend scenarios would impact those type of resources. So I don't know, maybe that's just an observation, but yeah, I'll just leave that out there. I don't think there's actually a question, but interested if others had that same impression or if PSE has a response to that.
I guess I could just add a little clarity for everyone. I think it's a really good interpretation, Joel, of kind of what's going on here. The reason we have some of those specific things like distributed generation, energy efficiency, demand response called out specifically on here is in the past through the IRP engagement, we found that those things are really important to this group and other external engagement on how much we're assuming we're going after in different scenarios. And so we just wanted to give you the opportunity if you thought it was important to add some color there. The other thing that's worth noting, your comment about the distributed system and the infrastructure for the pipes and wires. So these loads on these bookend scenarios all feed into not only the IRP, but also at the system level as well. So this is really setting, like if we assumed a high electrification, that would influence the decrease on demand on the gas system as well as the increased demand on the electric system, and then it would filter through our different planning processes to identify the infrastructure and investment impacts accordingly, if that kind of helps. Like, so these are all setting up and all the same loads will go through to ensure that we're being consistent across the scenarios and evaluating the increases and decreases and or increases on the systems collectively.
That's helpful, Jennifer. And I guess am I understanding sort of the bookends right, in that it's like sort of a high stress on the system scenario, the electric system scenario versus maybe whatever the opposite of that would be?
Yeah, it's kind of, what would you think is the most stress the system could be within a nearer term time frame that would impact some investments and drive some movement on the electric system, and what would be that corresponding impact on the gas system, and what would that mean for them, the gas system as well, right? And so collectively together we can look at it holistically.
So, and in that case, I mean, I'm seeing, I think there's a sticky tab, the high customer adoption of distributed generation, it looks like. on the low electric demand side, which I think is right because that's a decrease. I mean, that DG is understood to be a decrement to PSE's like load forecast, right? But if we're talking about high stress on the electric system versus low stress on the electric system as our bookends, DG might actually be an asset that would help to mitigate the need for more like utility system infrastructure, delivery system infrastructure, as well as more utility scale resources, right?
I guess I would see that as going into the high side. So another way to consider the high is like if there's a lot of stress on the electric system, that means there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of stimulus in the economy. So people are spending money, they're investing, they're moving things forward. So distributed generation is more expensive. So if customers are investing in those things, maybe that's on the high side. Not to say it wouldn't be in the low side, but maybe the higher end of it, right, would be on the high end, and then there'd still be some distributed generation on the low end for sure, but maybe it's not as high as the potential on the higher side. Does that help? I don't know.
I guess so.
Ideas.
What I'm getting
Ideas.
at this is maybe more definition around what the bookends are meant to be capturing, what those potential futures are, what we're describing here would be helpful.
So maybe Jennifer, we could kind of follow up with Joel, if that's okay, if there's additional information we can share after the meeting. I was going to move us into wrapping up this section. Eliza, I believe your hand is up from before. Is that correct? Is that just residual?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll assume it is. Great. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of skip this second part of the mural activity for now because we're running short on time and we still need to get to public comment. So what we'll do is we'll be sending this mural out for you all to be able to do after the meeting to continue to work on it. And as Sophie said, we'll continue this conversation during our next meeting. And so thank you all for participating. And Sophie, over to you.
Sure. Will, can you just put up the deck again so people can see those next steps options? And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn it to Kara for kind of some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie and Annie. So I just wanted to circle back really quickly to the RPAG membership discussion we had at the beginning of the meeting and just provide a little bit more clarity as a few questions have come up via direct message. So per the charter and outlined in an email we sent to RPAG members in mid-October, we are recruiting for new members to fill at least 2 vacancies. And I mentioned that at the beginning of our meeting. Of note, Jim Dennison did propose that his seat be filled by Don Marsh, and we notified them of our approach in late September. As described in the email and in our charter, our RPAG membership is really based on individual qualifications and selection. And so the organization that each of you represent is an important factor in the overall selection process, but specific seats are not allocated to specific organizations, with the exception of commission staff and public counsel. Those are the 2 in the charter that are called out a little bit differently. So we certainly look forward to considering new members as part of our recruitment process later this year. So that came up at the beginning. There were some questions. I just wanted to come back to it, and back to you, Sophie. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kara. So the feedback forum was going to close in a week. There's going to be a public webinar in mid-November, an evening and a daytime time. And then in December, you're going to have an RPAG meeting. So one last plug to fill out that doodle poll. Emily dropped the doodle poll link back into the chat. And we're going to then switch now to public comment. So I see, let's see if the hand raising feature is working. Fantastic. So I'm going to switch on over here to the timer. And I see Don's hand. So Don, can you come off of mute? Make sure we can hear you okay. Let's see. Don, can we hear you okay?
Oh, I finally got the unmute dialogue. Thank you.
Very good. All right, Don, your 2 minutes start now.
Well, Sierra Club is very disappointed that we were eliminated from the RPAG just because Jim couldn't be here. We provided two alternates that PSE rejected without really telling us. I mean, they said there was a process, but didn't tell us that we weren't allowed to participate until until I tried to log in today. So that's quite disappointing from a public participation standpoint. I am also disappointed in the fact that the clean energy targets are not being met. I understand that there are challenges. It's just that these targets are very important for the sake of our communities and the planet. And it really shows that there's been a weakness in the planning process that PSE has been so surprised. Now, the low hydro, as Fred said, is very challenging. We have been warning for years that this would be a possibility. It was actually called out by the EPA. And so to sort of be caught flat-footed on that is not encouraging, and it calls into question whether we're really going to be able to meet the CETA targets or not. And those are really, really important. So anyway, we will be submitting more comment into the docket about those things. Thank you very much for the chance to comment.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Don, for your participation today and your comments now. Next, we have Thomas Kramer. Tom, can you talk? Can we hear you?
Yes, can you hear me?
We sure can. Your 2 minutes start now.
Okay. First, with regard to the CETA and interim targets, even though 98 proposals for 14 gigawatts were received in response to the RFPs, apparently the problems identified on slide 17 today have prevented them from coming online, except for excessively expensive resources, as outlined on slide 14. But the pathway to overcoming these problems and achieving the 2030 clean energy obligations on slide 22, that lacks specifics. This might help. PSE will be required to undertake several assessments of the potential for developing new and more diverse renewable resources in the ISP rulemaking to implement, which will be done to implement HB 1589. PSE can use this requirement to its advantage through an aggressive program of evaluating potential new resources upfront for more targeted RFPs, and perhaps even planning utility-owned resources that could be competitive with external energy providers. With regard to scenario framing, the ISP rulemaking will require transitioning PSE off of gas over time, but this is not evident from the framing discussion. HB 1589 requires ISP scenarios meeting greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets of 45% by 2030, 70% by 2040, and 95% by 2050. This will mean reducing gas distribution by these amounts. I understand that the 2023 gas IRP scenarios shown on slide 31 are only examples, but they are unrealistic for the ISP that must meet these Decarbonization Act emissions reductions. Thank you for the opportunity to comment. I see I'm out of time.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Thomas, for your comments. I'm looking at our list here and I'm not seeing any other public commenters, but I'll make a final call here. Okay. Well, with that, I'll announce that our meeting is adjourned with the final note that in the chat, I'm going to just put my personal email to everyone who participated today. I've really enjoyed getting to know you all over the last couple of years here, and I'm excited to stay in touch with Annie and just hear about the tremendous work that you all will do together. It's a very talented group of people, and as a PSE customer, I'm very relieved to know that individuals like you all, the RPAG, members of the public, and the PSE staff are really working hard on this clean energy transformation. So thank you for having me along, and I know you'll just really enjoy working with Annie, and I hope everyone enjoys the next Halloween season here. Take care, everyone.
Thank you so much for all your work, Sophie.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks,
Great
everyone.
Facilitator.
Thank you.